The scream jolted me awake. For a moment I thought it had come from me, but then I heard it again, high-pitched, guttural, and coming from somewhere inside the bar. My chest tightened as I sat up, realizing I was still in the storeroom. I hadn't meant to fall asleep here, but now something was wrong. The room was pitch black, the faint glow from the cracked mirror behind the bar barely visible through the cracked door. My breath hitched when I noticed it, a shadow stretching across the floor, far too tall and too thin to belong to anything human. I froze. The shadow moved. The scream came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural growl that rattled the walls. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was behind me. I turned my head just enough to glance over my shoulder, and there it was, a figure in the corner, half hidden in the dark. It was tall, its head brushing the ceiling, its body twitching unnaturally. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly red, locked directly on me. My throat tightened as its arm jerked upward, pointing straight at me. Then, in a voice that sounded like nails dragged across steel, it rasped, "You broke the rule." I scrambled backward, my foot catching on something. I fell hard, but I didn't care. I had to get out. My hands clawed for the door handle, fumbling in the dark as that thing moved closer, its limbs creaking like old wood. Finally, I wrenched the door open and stumbled into the bar, but the humming sound hit me like a wall. The room was alive, the air vibrating with a low, menacing tone that made my teeth ache. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear it following me. The shadow was still following me. I could feel it, hear its dragging steps behind me as I staggered into the main bar. The air was thick, almost suffocating, carrying the faint, metallic tang of blood. I didn't know where Malcolm had gone. He'd been here earlier, hadn't he? But now the bar felt impossibly empty, the kind of empty that makes your skin crawl. I slammed the door shut behind me, but the handle burned hot to the touch, forcing me to pull my hand back. Then I saw the customer. He wasn't there before. At least I didn't think so. He was sitting at the far end of the bar, his wide-brimmed hat casting shadows over his face. His hand tapped slowly against the counter, a deliberate, rhythmic motion that sent chills down my spine. Did he pay? The thought hit me like a cold slap. I didn't remember checking. Malcolm had warned me about rule number 1, never let a customer leave without paying. The tapping stopped, and the man turned his head just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. His eyes were hollow, empty black pits. A grin spread across his face, his teeth too sharp, too long. "You didn't ask," he said softly, his voice slicing through the heavy air. Panic set in as I fumbled for words, but then I heard it. A whisper behind me. "Offer him the special drink. Rule number 2. I grabbed the black bottle from the shelf, my hands trembling. It felt warm, almost pulsing, as if alive. I poured it into a glass and slid it across the counter. The man leaned forward, sniffed it, and smiled wider. "You'll regret this," he said before downing the drink in one gulp. The shadow behind me let out a low growl, and the rulebook on the counter flipped open to another page. Rule number 3. Never touch the mirror behind the bar. The mirror cracked violently. The mirror cracked again, a hairline fracture spreading like veins across its surface. My heart pounded as I stepped back, nearly tripping over the stool behind me. The bar was too quiet now, the humming sound from earlier replaced by an oppressive silence. I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against my chest. Then the door creaked open. A hooded figure stepped in, its movements slow and deliberate. The figure's shadow stretched unnaturally across the floor, too long for its body, curling and twisting like it had a mind of its own. "Special drink," the figure rasped, its voice hollow and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. My hands trembled as I reached for the black bottle again. The liquid inside seemed thicker this time, darker, as if it absorbed the light around it. I poured the drink, the bubbling sound unnerving in the stillness of the room. The figure didn't move as I placed the glass on the counter. For a moment, it just stood there, its hood obscuring any hint of a face. Then, slowly, it lifted the glass and drank, the liquid disappearing into an unseen void. When the glass was empty, the figure leaned forward slightly. Beneath the hood, I caught a glimpse of pale, stretched skin and deep-set, empty eye sockets. "The last one didn't last long," it whispered, the words dragging out as if savoring them. I didn't reply. I couldn't. My throat was dry, my legs trembling. The figure straightened, its shadow writhing across the floor like it was alive. As it turned to leave, I noticed something horrifying. The shadow didn't follow it. It lingered near the bar, shifting slowly toward the cracked mirror. And then the whispering began again. The shadow slid closer to the cracked mirror, twisting and contorting like it was alive. My chest tightened, the air growing colder with every second. I couldn't move. I didn't dare take my eyes off the thing in front of me. The mirror groaned softly, the cracks spreading like spiderwebs. Then I saw it. My reflection wasn't moving with me anymore. It stood there, perfectly still, staring back with wide, empty eyes. My stomach churned as I realized the reflection wasn't just wrong. It was watching me. Behind me, the mirror reflected Malcolm, even though he wasn't in the room. His face was pale, gaunt, his mouth moving silently. I turned, expecting to see him standing there, but the space was empty. Don't look too long. The words weren't spoken aloud. They came from the mirror, Malcolm's reflection mouthing the warning as the tapping sound grew louder. I backed away, but my reflection stayed in place, tilting its head unnaturally as if mocking me. The tapping turned into sharp, deliberate knocks, like something was trying to get out. "Stop," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, just stop." But the mirror answered with a low, hollow laugh. My reflection's grin widened unnaturally, stretching across its face like a crack in the glass. The shadow slithered closer to me now, crawling up the bar and onto the walls. It reached for the mirror, its edges flickering like fire. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to run, but the mirror spoke again, in a voice that wasn't mine. "You broke the rules. Now we'll break you." A deafening crack split the air, and the mirror shattered. The lights flickered wildly, and the room plunged into darkness. The darkness was absolute. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body locked as the last echo of the mirror's shattering faded. My breathing was shallow, loud in the suffocating silence, but the sound of something else filled the room. A faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. Then the lights flickered back on, dim and sickly yellow. The bar was different. The walls seemed closer, warped, as though the room itself was breathing. My eyes darted to the floor, and I stopped cold. The shadow was still there, but it wasn't just moving anymore, it was growing. Thick tendrils of darkness slithered across the floor, snaking toward me. I stepped back, but my foot hit something solid. "Don't look away." The voice was low and rasping, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. I turned slowly and saw him, the man with hollow eyes. He was sitting at the bar again, his smile stretched too wide across his face. His eyes bore into mine, endless pits of darkness that made my stomach churn. I couldn't help it. I blinked. His smile widened, his teeth too many, too sharp. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into a nauseating rhythm of dark and light. With every flicker, he was closer, his body twitching as if caught in some terrible stutter. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling as I felt the shadow crawling up my calves, cold and suffocating. The man stood now, towering over me. His voice was a whisper that clawed its way into my head. "You'll need to clean this up." I screamed, but it didn't feel like sound escaped me. The lights went out completely, leaving me in a choking silence. Somewhere in the darkness, the scratching began again. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, rumbling hum that seemed to rise from the floor itself. The lights flickered back on, dimmer now, casting long, distorted shadows across the bar. I could feel it before I saw it. The room wasn't empty anymore. They were everywhere. Figures filled the bar, seated at every stool, slouched in every booth. Shadowy forms shifted and pulsed, their outlines blurring like smoke. One leaned closer, and I recoiled. Its face was a hollow void, but faint red lights glowed where eyes should have been. Another figure, farther down, bled thick black ink onto the counter, the liquid snaking toward me like it had a purpose. I tried to back away, but there was no escape. They all turned toward me at once, their movements slow and deliberate, their gazes, if they even had eyes, locked on me. "Drinks," one rasped, its voice like gravel scraping metal. Another slammed the counter, its clawed hand leaving deep grooves in the wood. The bottles rattled violently on the shelves behind me as I scrambled to pour, my hands shaking so badly that half the drink spilled onto the bar. Each drink seemed to warp them further. The shadowy forms grew larger, their edges jagged and sharp. The woman with glowing red eyes downed her drink in one gulp, her mouth splitting wider than humanly possible, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Then one leaned close, the smell of decay wafting off it. Its words were soft, but they cut through the noise like a knife. "Do you know what you've agreed to by working here?" I opened my mouth to reply, but before I could speak, the figure stood abruptly and left, its shadow staying behind. And the humming grew louder. The humming swelled to a deafening roar, vibrating through the walls as if the entire bar was alive and angry. My hands trembled as I reached for something, anything, that could ground me. But the countertop felt wrong under my palms. The once smooth wood was now rough and damp, pulsating like it had veins beneath its surface. I had to get out of here. I stumbled toward the back room, desperate for a moment to think. The door creaked open, and I stepped into the cramped storage area, breathing heavily. The air was stifling, thick with the smell of mold and something coppery. That's when I saw it. A leather-bound book lay on the shelf, its cover worn and stained. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to demand my attention. My fingers hesitated as I reached for it, but something deep inside urged me to look. The pages crackled as I flipped them open. It was a ledger, filled with names, hundreds of them, all scrawled in messy, uneven handwriting. Beside each name was a note: broke rule number 2, taken; failed rule number 5, devoured; quit without notice, consumed. My heart sank as I turned to the final entry. The name was scratched out so violently that the paper beneath had torn. But beneath the jagged marks, one word was etched in dark ink: Malcolm. A cold realization crept over me. Malcolm wasn't just training me. He'd been stuck here too. Before I could process it, the lights flickered, and the humming stopped abruptly. The silence was worse. From somewhere behind me, a soft, rasping whisper broke the stillness. "You're next." The whisper lingered in the air, cold and sharp like a blade pressed to the back of my neck. "You're next." I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The ledger was still in my hands, its cracked pages trembling as I held it tighter, desperate for some clue, some escape. Then, faintly, the humming began again, low and uneven, like it was struggling to stay alive. The sound wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from the bar. I stepped out of the storeroom, drawn by the noise. The bar was empty, but the bottles on the shelves were vibrating, their glass bodies trembling against one another. I froze when I saw the black bottle. It wasn't vibrating like the others. It was glowing faintly, pulsing with an eerie light that matched the hum. "You have to serve it," a voice said behind me. I nearly screamed, whipping around to see Malcolm standing in the doorway, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes darker than I remembered. He didn't move closer, just stared at the bottle like it was a loaded gun. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's their bond," he said, his words heavy with dread. "The drink ties them to this place, to whatever's keeping this bar alive. If you refuse to serve it, they'll take what they need from you instead." I looked back at the bottle. The liquid inside seemed thicker now, swirling like smoke trapped in glass. "Who are they?" I asked, but Malcolm just shook his head. "They're the reason we don't leave," he muttered. "And the reason you won't either." The lights flickered again, and the bar seemed to grow darker. The black bottle pulsed once more, and the humming grew louder. The bottle shattered. One moment it was glowing, pulsing with an ominous hum, and the next it exploded in a burst of dark, viscous liquid that splattered across the bar. The lights above flickered violently, plunging the room into bursts of shadow and light. The hum grew louder, deeper, vibrating through my bones. I stumbled back, slipping on the thick black liquid that now oozed across the floor. It wasn't just liquid. It was alive. Tendrils stretched from the puddle, writhing and curling like searching fingers. "Malcolm!" I screamed, but he was gone. The doorway he had stood in moments ago was empty, replaced by nothing but a yawning black void. The tendrils began to climb up the bar, reaching for the shelves and knocking bottles to the ground. Each crash was drowned out by the deafening hum, now so loud it felt like my skull would split. Then I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps echoed from behind me, accompanied by a sickening wet squelch. I turned, my breath hitching as my stomach dropped. The figures were back, the shadowy patrons from earlier. But now they were more defined. Solid, human-shaped, yet horribly wrong. Their faces were still blank voids, but their bodies shifted, flickering between forms, as if they couldn't hold their shape. One stepped forward, its head twitching unnaturally. It pointed at me with a long, gnarled finger. "You broke the bond," it rasped, its voice layered, like dozens of whispers speaking in unison. "Now, you belong to us." The tendrils surged forward, latching onto my ankles with an icy grip. I screamed and clawed at the bar, trying to pull free, but the shadows dragged me toward the center of the room, and then the floor began to split open. The floor groaned beneath me, splitting with an agonizing sound like tearing flesh. A deep, crimson glow seeped through the cracks, bathing the room in an eerie light. The tendrils coiled tighter around my legs, their icy grip burning against my skin. I clawed at the bar, desperate to hold on, but the wood splintered under my fingers as the tendrils yanked me closer to the gaping fissure that had opened in the center of the room. From the darkness below came a chorus of guttural whispers, overlapping and growing louder, their words too fragmented to understand. The shadowy figures loomed closer, their movements jerky and unnatural. One bent down, its hollow face inches from mine, its voice a low hiss. "You can't leave. You never could." I thrashed against the tendrils, kicking wildly, but they only tightened, dragging me closer to the edge. My heart pounded, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The fissure widened, revealing a swirling void below, filled with flickering shapes that looked almost human. And then I saw them. Faces. Pale, desperate faces, their mouths open in silent screams, reaching upward with clawed hands. I tried to look away, but their hollow eyes locked onto mine, pulling me deeper into their nightmare. Above me, the lights flickered violently, the bulbs bursting one by one. The figures began to chant, their voices a sickening harmony that made my ears ring. "Join us. Serve forever, join us." The tendrils gave one final, violent tug, and I lost my grip on the bar. I screamed as I was dragged into the abyss, the faces below twisting into grotesque grins. The last thing I saw before the void swallowed me was the ledger, floating in midair, its pages flipping to reveal one final line. Rule number 6, there is no escape. The fall felt endless. The air was thick and cold, rushing past me in an unnatural silence. I couldn't scream anymore, my throat was raw and the sound seemed swallowed by the void. Around me, shadows moved, twisting and curling like smoke, their shapes just human enough to terrify me. Then I hit something. It wasn't solid, more like crashing into water, but it burned. My skin seared as I sank into the strange, glowing substance. It pulsed like a heartbeat, red and black swirling together, and I realized it wasn't just liquid. Faces churned within it, their mouths open in soundless screams. Their hands reached for me, dragging me deeper. I kicked wildly, fighting to break free, but their grip was relentless. One face pushed closer, its eyes wide and unblinking, its mouth whispering a single word. "Stay." A sharp pain shot through my chest, and I gasped as I was yanked upward. The liquid clung to me like tar, but I was rising, pulled by unseen hands. I emerged into a dimly lit room that wasn't the bar, at least not anymore. The walls were alive, covered in twisting tendrils that pulsed with the same red glow. The air was heavy, filled with a low, guttural hum that made my head throb. In the center of the room stood the ledger, floating above a dark pedestal. Its pages flipped wildly, faster than I could follow, before it stopped on a new line. Rule number 7. You belong to them now. The room shook violently, the tendrils reaching for me again. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows reappeared, closing in, their empty faces fixed on mine. And then I heard it, the sound of my own voice, whispering, "Welcome back." The whisper echoed, soft and mocking. "Welcome back." My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the pulsating floor. It felt alive, a strange, wet texture that sent chills through me. The shadows were closer now, their movements slow but deliberate, as if savoring my fear. I scrambled backward, but the walls twisted and stretched, their veins pulsing in time with the low hum that had become unbearable. "Stay away," I choked out, my voice barely audible over the noise. The ledger floated higher, the pages flipping again. The words burned themselves into the air, glowing red before fading into darkness. Rule number 8. Serve or be served. A sharp, metallic screech tore through the room. My head snapped toward the sound. The bar counter had reappeared, warped and blackened, its surface crawling with tendrils. On it sat the black bottle, whole again, but bubbling violently. One of the shadowy figures stepped forward, its form shifting with each step. Its head jerked unnaturally, tilting to one side as it pointed at the bottle. "Pour," it rasped, its voice a chorus of overlapping whispers. I shook my head, terror freezing me in place. The figure didn't move, but the room did. The walls seemed to close in, the floor rising and falling like a breathing creature. The shadows began to chant, their voices blending into a horrible rhythmic growl. "Pour, pour, pour." I reached for the bottle with trembling hands, the heat of it searing my skin as I lifted it. The liquid inside hissed and bubbled, black smoke rising in thin spirals. "What happens if I don't?" I whispered, barely able to speak. The figure leaned closer, its empty face inches from mine. "Then we pour you." The bottle pulsed in my hand, and the room plunged into darkness. The darkness pressed against me, thick and suffocating. My fingers tightened around the bottle, its surface now unbearably hot, searing my palms. I could hear them, the shadows, circling me, their whispers growing louder, their chant hammering into my skull. Pour, pour, pour. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, pinned by invisible hands. The floor beneath me began to pulse violently, cracks spreading out like spider webs. Through the glowing fissures, I could see those faces again, twisted, screaming, clawing at the edges, desperate to pull me down. "I can't," I muttered, my voice cracking. The words felt hollow, useless against the relentless chant. The shadows surged closer, their forms flickering like broken projections. One leaned in, its face inches from mine. It wasn't empty anymore. Instead, my own reflection stared back at me, its mouth moving in perfect sync with the chant. The bottle trembled in my hand, the liquid inside bubbling furiously. I could feel it pulling at me, like it had its own gravity, begging to be released. My arm moved involuntarily, the bottle tilting toward the waiting tendrils on the bar. "Stop!" I screamed, forcing myself to pull back, but the bottle wouldn't let go. Suddenly, the ledger slammed shut with a deafening crack, the sound cutting through the chaos. The chant stopped. The room froze. The shadows retreated, melting into the walls. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, a single word echoed from the void. "Serve." The bottle exploded in my hands, black liquid spraying across my face. It burned like acid, and I fell to my knees, clawing at my skin. When I looked up, the bar was empty again. Silent. But the ledger sat on the counter, open to one line. Rule number 9. You're already theirs. The bar was still. I wiped the black liquid from my face, my hands trembling, but the burning sensation didn't fade. My skin felt wrong, like it didn't belong to me anymore. The silence was suffocating, heavy with an unseen presence. The ledger sat on the counter, its pages eerily still now. My eyes locked onto the final rule, glowing faintly in the dim light. Rule number 9. You're already theirs. I backed away, my chest heaving. The bar felt different, bigger, darker. The walls stretched impossibly high, fading into a ceiling I could no longer see. The air buzzed faintly, and the floor beneath me pulsed like a living thing. That's when I saw the reflection. In the cracked mirror behind the bar, I wasn't alone. Dozens of figures stood behind me, their shapes blurry but unmistakable. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. When I looked back, they were closer. My reflection stepped forward. Not me, but the version of me in the mirror. Its face twisted into a grotesque grin, teeth sharp and glistening. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, and whispered in a voice that wasn't mine. "Your shift is just beginning." The mirror shattered, and I fell backward, slamming into the bar. The shadows returned, swirling around me, whispering my name over and over. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. When I opened my eyes, I was standing behind the bar. The room was pristine again, quiet, glowing faintly under dim lights. The ledger was gone. The black bottle was whole, sitting in its usual place, and the door creaked open. "Special drink," rasped a voice from the shadowy figure entering the bar. I smiled. Too wide, too sharp, and reached for the bottle. The rules were watching now.